so hard to get your head around the idea that your average functionary in this worldview believes everything is pretend, but they have better values than everybody else. It's not some transcendent spiritual world. He says it's society that throws us in chains. All of a sudden, so now it's not a religious or a spiritual or a transcendent realm imprisoning people in the material. It's now sociological, in fact, realm.
All right, well, it finally happened. Many of you have been asking for this for several years, to get James Lindsay on the show. We went over some great things, the DNA of wokeness or social justice. This is something I cover a lot, but I want you to hear his takes. He is very, very well read from the original sources, and this is the key. When people tell you what is going on, what wokeism is, what critical race theory is, what queer theory is, you need to know from the original sources, those that are actually creating this, and I'm going to call it a theology. It is a doctrine of wokeism. And I have learned this over the years. I've studied since back in 2012, that when you talk to someone and they don't believe you, you think to yourself, well, why would you not believe me? The authors of this, the movers and shakers, here it is in their books. Here it is in their speeches. But they won't believe it. They won't believe that the tree that produced the fruit that they are partaking of is bad. Now, this episode is brought to you by Cardio Miracle, my favorite supplement. All of my labs have changed since I started taking this. I've been taking it now for a little over a year. My cardiologist, and this for me, if you know me, is something very new, said in September, your arteries look fantastic. Went in with an angiogram to look at everything. Your arteries look fantastic. I could not believe those words were coming out of his mouth. Give it a shot. 90-day money-back guarantee. Go to cwicmedia.com. That's CWIC media.com. Scroll to the bottom and watch the video on what this has done for me. Here we go. All right, welcome to Cwic Show. My name is Greg Mattson, and I am your host. In this episode, we have brought on James Lindsay, who really has become one of the primary voices in critical social justice, or fighting critical social justice. James, welcome to the show.
Hey, I'm glad to be here.
I want to start off in talking about the DNA of critical social justice. Oftentimes, I'm out talking to people about this, and I've learned that if you don't really let people understand where this is coming from, what are the roots of this, it really just becomes an idea of empathy, right? And it's because that's really what is used to kind of pull on the heartstrings of individuals without really understanding where this is coming from. Can you go over the DNA a little bit of how we've gotten to this woke culture?
Yeah, well, I mean, this can be a very long answer if you want a very long answer.
Let's do it.
Well, let's start by going back to a definite placeholder that people will understand in history, and that's Karl Marx. So woke, as we call it, or critical social justice, as it's more formally described, is actually more accurately called woke Marxism. It is an adaptation of Marxism. So I kind of like that you've used DNA as a way to bring this up, because I actually want people to think in terms of kind of descendants, like ideological evolution. And so we're going to start with Karl Marx. Karl Marx wrote in the Communist Manifesto on the very first page of the first chapter that, in the simplest expression, what his model was about, what communism was about, was the division between oppressor and oppressed. And I think everybody sees that that's what's going on with the so-called critical social justice movement. And what he was actually driving at, a lot of people think, well, Marx put out a big economic theory. He didn't put out an economic theory at all. He put out in fact, cult religion. And the way you can tell that it's a religion is that it answers fundamental questions about what it means to be human and assigns people duties of conscience in accordance with that view of the world and of ourselves. What does he think the reality of human beings is? Well, he thinks the reality of human beings is that we are a creative species. In other words, we can imagine what we want to see in the world and then make that come into the world. Philosophically, that's called, there are two forms of creative activity philosophically. One is called poiesis, which is that we can create something that's new in the world. And the other is called praxis, which is that we can, by continually doing something, we can become that thing. And so what do I mean by that? Well, imagine that you're a builder and you build a house. So you get the materials, the carpentry, the sheetrock, whatever it takes to put the house together. You get the thing, the foundation, you build a house. There was no house before. Now there's a house. That was an act of poiesis, and you have created that. So you are a creative being, not unlike God, as a matter of fact, because you can create something that wasn't before. And the first step of that creation is to imagine it in your subjective vision, then to bring it to reality in the objective world. And then you can see yourself in your creation. I built that. So the idea of building a house, for example, would be an act of poetic creation. But on the other hand, you have this thing he calls praxis, which is this continual act of becoming. So you've built a house, people move in, and it slowly becomes a home. It gets imbued with sentiment. It gets filled with memories. It becomes, a symbol of the family and the people that live there, and the effort that people put in to make it into a home. But when does it become a home? Is it the instant somebody moves in? Or no, actually, that's this kind of ongoing process that's always developing once you move in. That's what would be called practical or praxis-based creation. And this is where we get the idea of the word practice. You don't go out on the football field and get a coach one day and tomorrow you're a football player. You're always becoming a football player by the act of playing football. And so the coach is guiding you to get better at it. So there's these two kinds of things. And he says that human beings actually have both of these. They don't just build things and bring things into being. They also do so starting from their imagination, but they also are continually building not just houses and homes, but they're also building society. And through building society, we're building ourselves. We are, in fact, our own creator. He casts down God out of the story. He says the creator of man is man. Man builds a society around himself. That society socializes the next generation and even the current generation into modes of behavior and activity and being that make you who you are. And so man is creating man in this kind of endless circle of creation. And so he's actually answering a very fundamental question of what does it mean to be human? That's not an economic theory, by the way. That's way different than an economic theory. So what Marx started to ask with this oppressor versus oppressed thing is he said, well, how are people made? And living in the heat of the Industrial Revolution as a leftist, he looked around his world and he said, well, people are made by their economic conditions. If you are an oppressed worker, your whole life is determined by the fact that you have to work to earn a wage. You don't get to go live the life that you want. In fact, you don't even get to create the things that you want because you don't have the time and energy because that's being exploited by these other people. So you are off doing, say that, you're the worker, you're doing your boss's vision. You're bringing his vision into the world. You become a tool of his creative capacity and thus lose your creative capacity. You sacrifice yours in order to earn a wage. And this creates this intrinsic conflict that he said was based actually in the fundamental root of that being the very idea of private property, which he says in the Communist Manifesto we must abolish, but he explains a few years earlier that what communism really means isn't the abolition of private property, it is the transcendence of private property, moving to a higher spiritual level with regard to how we engage with ownership. So this is, again, a religion. And he says that you have to practice this. You have to go out and do praxis to make society. In fact, what he says is we have to seize the means of production. He's talking about the means of production of economic things like factories, farms, and so on. But remember, he thinks those produce the society and that the society goes on to produce man. One of the things that produces society, by the way, is also the state. So he wants to produce or seize the means of production of society through economic and political means, hence the focus on what he calls political economy. So the goal of Marxism is to produce humans. And everybody who is awakened to the Marxist view of the world which means that they know that they're creative and they also know that they're social at their fundamental essence. Everybody who's awakened to that has a duty of conscience to do the work, to do the activity, to do the activism, to bring about the revolution that seizes the means of production and puts it in the hands of the enlightened, who understand that man is intrinsically a creative and social being who's being alienated from himself through the expropriation of property that's caused by the ownership of private property, which he calls capitalist society. So that's Karl Marx, right? And I think it's pretty clear that he's not laying out an economic theory now. He's laying out a theory of humanity, which is to say, in a sense, because it's a system of belief and practice that answers fundamental questions about the world and man's role in it, such that it gives rise to duties of conscience. That's the definition the Supreme Court uses to decide if something is a religion, trying to stay out of the theology of it completely. It meets all of those criteria very, very directly. And we see their activism is constant. It's just that protest is for them going to church. It's actually not them. They don't go to a church service. They go out and protest in the streets because the goal is to move society somewhere. Marx, actually, we could say he got this from his predecessor Hegel, because he mentions Hegel a lot and his architecture is built off of that. But really, both of those guys, Marx and Hegel, got their ideas from Rousseau. And Rousseau is the father of the French Revolution, the father of Romanticism. And he believed that society itself, the social arrangement, it puts men in chains. In fact, his most famous remark is, "Man is born free, but everywhere he's in chains." And what he meant by that is we have to live according to the rules of society. We don't get to live however we want. If we want to run naked through the street, somebody's going to yell at us. We can't do that. And knowing Rousseau, if you know much about his personal history, his biography, he probably did want to run naked through the streets and people wouldn't let him. He was kind of that kind of guy.
Famous a lot of those in the DNA are kind of that kind of guy.
The famous for fathering a lot of children he refused to take care of with random women and so on. I mean, Rousseau was not an upstanding character, but he pictured in a society in which human beings could actually tap back into their primordial, unsocialized, as he rephrased to it, savage nature, the noble savage concept, but bring that forward so that you could still have the benefits of living in the city, fine food, orderly things to do, and access to women, probably, if we're just being real about Rousseau's motivations. And the fact of the matter is he wanted to create something that he himself referred to as savages made to inhabit cities. So in other words, humans should somehow mix their kind of primordial nature with civilized nature to find something that escapes the chains of civilized society, but gets to reap all the benefits of it, which sounds very much like throwing away responsibility, but thinking that you get to live the good life, which is a fundamental entitlement complex that we see all the way down, whether it's from the French Romantic movements that went radical, or whether it's from the Marxists that inherited this worldview. But when you hear a sentence like "man is born free, but everywhere he's in chains," what we're actually looking at, to go a far deeper direction, so we'll go backwards before we come forward from Marx, is the Gnostic heresies of early Christianity. What you're seeing is people saying that the world is constructed by evil spirits, more or less, so that we're trapped in our material conditions and we can't escape them. And it turns out that that's not who we are at all. The ancient Gnostics believed that we were purely spiritual beings, in fact, one with God, entirely one with God, that were imprisoned in a material world by an evil spirit posing as God that they called the demiurge. And the goal was to gain the secret knowledge, the gnosis, that would free you from this prison of existence. So then we come forward to Rousseau again, taking these same ideas, which were very popular in Europe in the 17th and 18th centuries, and with the kind of noble classes. And Rousseau says, it's not some transcendent spiritual world. He says it's society that throws us in chains. It's society. It's this all of a sudden. So now it's not a religious or a spiritual or a transcendent realm of imprisoning people in the material. It's now a sociological, in fact, realm. And this is what Marx picked up and said, that sociological realm is determined specifically by economics revolving around private property. Now, it turns out that was enough to get a lot of agitation. Marx got chased out of Germany. He got chased out of France, where he posted up for a long time in Paris. He ended up dying in London because the British wouldn't throw him out, which is sort of a morality tale somehow that we can ponder. But and he got thrown out of those other countries for inciting revolutionary action, for actually, in effect, committing sedition, as we would say it today. And they didn't want they didn't just chase him out because he's a unpopular guy. He was actually organizing people and causing problems. Okay, so we go forward. This worked out really well in the early 20th century, his model. When it got applied by Lenin to a peasant society in Russia, which became the USSR after the revolution, and it worked very well in the peasant society in China, and it worked well in Southeast Asian peasant societies, and it worked fairly well in South American peasant societies. But what it didn't work well in during any of this time was Europe or America at all. These industrial societies Marx said would be the epicenter of transformation didn't go into it. Capitalism wasn't actually causing them to turn radical. Turns out being a peasant under a feudal tyrant is pretty good fuel for revolution. But it turns out that having a working class life where you're building your way up and making things better for your family is terrible fuel for a revolution. And so Western Marxism was born in the 20s and 30s to try to answer this question of how to infiltrate Western society and how to deal with the fact that Marx was wrong about the inevitability of capitalism leading to a revolution. And so out of Western Marxism, slowly the Marxist oppressor versus oppressed dynamic started to evolve to what are the social conditions at work to infiltrate, say, the American conscience. It's not economics, because at the end of the day, Americans for 200 and something years have basically said, your life sucks, okay, get a job and you can work your way up. And because that American dream actually exists, the economic resentment can't take root properly in the United States. The biggest, I think, the most effective that it's taken place was during the robber baron era with the big industrialists who are actually monopolists. And once the antitrust laws came in to prevent monopoly activity, it fell apart. The next biggest push for this was probably in the 60s with the radical students, and the third biggest push for it is the millennial generation, which is kind of caught up in feeling like the permanent renters, and they can't get a foot. They have huge amounts of debt because they went to college just as it got expensive, blah blah blah. So there is some economic basis there. They're importing one now across the border that's totally impoverished, so we have basis for another economic conflict there. But what they realized was that in America, we're soft to racial dynamics. We're soft to any minority. So whether racial minorities, sexual minorities, we're soft to the inappropriate treatment of women. And they exploited those values against us to develop critical race theory, a very radical Marxist style of feminism, queer theory, or radical gender ideology, as it's sometimes called. Those things were developed over time through the West and others, ability studies or disability studies, whatever they call this, and then fat studies and all the rest of them. You can imagine the whole pantheon of these things. But they developed these because we're soft to the kind of civil rights injustices, where we are not particularly soft to economic injustice, because we have a system that allows people to thrive if they put in the effort. So that resentment and the displaced blame necessary, it's those guys causing all your problem. It's society oppressing you that keeps you in chains. It's the capitalist class keeping you, the demiurge as capitalist class, keeping you exploited and alienated from your creative and social being. Those things don't work when you can just get a job and start being successful and actually, nose to the shoulder to the wheel, nose to the grindstone, whatever the saying is, and actually start building a better life. And the Marxists of the 60s and 70s recognized that capitalism in the West allows people to build a better life. That's the problem. And so we have to infiltrate culturally instead, using the soft spots of civil rights. And again, primarily minority groups being the vehicles. So this gives us woke. And so critical social justice is the critical theory of those radicals from the 60s applied to the concept of social justice in all domains: racial, sexual, sex-based, other identity factors, but also coming into other domains as well: immigrant status, but also class, somewhere down kind of in the mix, and all the rest that you can imagine. Like with COVID, it got applied versus, did you follow the rules or did you not? But it's the same exact idea that we're going to have a more just society by applying critical theory, which is designed to just tear society apart in the vein of Marx.
So you've got a great rundown there. I want to go back to the idea of this as a religion, a cult. I call it the religion of academia because that's where it foments in the halls of academia in the U.S. In fact, it's really interesting. I've got a lot of contacts at the UN, and delegates and NGOs, and to see the verbiage actually that is placed there. Yes, these are things that are brought in from Europe because, all of this developed in Europe, but it then gets exported to the US and academia here. And then, you come up with critical race theory with Crenshaw and intersectionality and all this other, in a way, kind of nuanced and articulated ideas that work better in the US. And now you go back and you look at the words of the UN, it's now exported back to Europe.
That's right.
Essentially, in an American style of social justice, where we've taken all of this continental philosophy, this strain of continental philosophy, kind of added our American mix to it, and now we're giving it back.
Yeah.
And so a dominant voice now at the UN is this intersectionality, but it's this religion. As you talk about Marx focusing on the individual really and society, you get the ideas of the new man, right? And the new woman, this transformation that, to me anyway, and tell me what you think on this, there's a difference between, for example, liberty and liberation. Yes. Right? This idea of liberation becomes what you're speaking of from Rousseau, Hegel, and moving forward. And this idea that we're going to throw off the shackles of society. We're going to throw these shackles off. The problem with that is that the problem is always out there.
Yeah.
Right. The problem is the systemic racism. The problem is, of course, focused on the West, is democracy and capitalism. But then compared to, say, for example, Christianity, where you have to say, well, I am a problem. I have to change. I need personal responsibility to take hold of my free will and be something or become something. It's almost a perversion of that.
Yeah.
With social justice that says, yeah, you need to become something. You need to throw off the shackles of society, not I need to throw off the shackles of my mistakes, of my errors. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it makes perfect sense. And it's a perfect way to understand that what we're dealing with is, in fact, a cult religion. Because when you brought up the concept of the new man, that's what the Gnostics in the first century referred to as the elect. The Gnostic elect. They're the people who had received at least some measure of gnosis. In other words, that saving secret knowledge, hidden knowledge, what the Bible really means or whatever, with some secret code. And they splinter off and became cults. Well, what we have in this situation with Rousseau and Marx is they developed what I'm referring to as sociological Gnosticism. So the society becomes the demiurgic power. The problem is out there. It's certainly not with you. Christianity, this is, I think, I frequently try to think of what are, like, from, a completely secular point of view, what are the biggest reasons that Christianity has been such a huge success? And this is one of them, is that it's ultimately down to the individual and the individual's relationship with himself and with God that is the crucial point. It doesn't matter if your church is saved. It matters if you are saved. And whatever the mechanisms that your particular theology teach is that whatever, right? But everybody in your whole church but you could be going into the abyss if you have it right and they don't have it and they're not willing to, get it right. It's not a group project.
It's not a collective necessarily. I mean, there's a collective, but it's still down to you.
Right. And the collective is actually voluntary, as long as you don't have a theocracy that's forcing you to be a part of the church. And so this is a completely opposite view of Marx's view that, well, there's this new man, well, the Gnostic view in general, there's a new man, and the new man actually understands the world completely better than everybody else. So they get all these privileges and everybody else has to be kept away from societal privileges or rights because they don't have the Enlightenment, so they'll use their freedom wrong. So they can't have any freedom. To be liberated means to agree with them, because those are the people that get to have the privileges in society. They get liberated from the very strict law of society that's meant to control the people who don't actually know. Well, for Marx, the secret gnosis was socialism. It's that man is intrinsically social. He doesn't actually say this thing is mine and that thing is yours. He says these things are ours. We can share and we can have, collective ownership and sharing of everything. And we transcend private property by understanding that what we have is communal property. And the community itself is generating the property for the entire community. So everybody has a stake or a share in it. Stakeholder theory being the kind of modern shape of this. And so what you end up with then is this Gnostic cult, which is the people who have the secret knowledge have to be the only ones allowed to have freedom of speech, right to vote, and so on, because they're the only ones who can be trusted to make the right decisions in a quote democracy. But what you have to do to get a real democracy, and this is straight from the mouth of Lenin, repeated straight from the mouth of Mao, is get rid of all of those elements that have wrong values so that they can't contribute, because they're creating what they call a false democracy or a bourgeois democracy that has to be stamped out. True democracy is only when the people who understand what it means to be the people, in other words, socialists. Well, we have the same mentality in the woke. The gnosis of critical race theory is anti-racism. The gnosis of feminism is feminist consciousness. The gnosis of queer theory is being queer or queer consciousness. The gnosis of kind of critical theory overall is critical consciousness. And of course, you could say that the socialist view derives from class consciousness. And so these are awakened or enlightened positions within a cult reading of the world and society. And like I said, you can see very clearly that there are duties of conscience attached to this. In other words, that they are compelled by their beliefs to go out and do the work and be on the right side of history in order to move history to its intended future state. And you can, when you start phrasing it the way that they actually have, it's extremely religious. So our universities that you brought up become seminaries in sociological Gnosticism. And of course, it would happen in the universities because that's where sociology developed. Sociology looks like a science, but it turns out to be social alchemy rather than social science.
Right. Yeah, that's really interesting. And I, you look back at Hegel, right? Especially young Hegel, who influences Marx so much. And he proposes the idea of the dialectic and this, what it produces is this arc of progression, right? Like what are we moving toward? We're moving toward, again, this idea of paving a path of liberation to the point where we can become one with reality. And it's kind of like the with Christianity, you have this idea of, that comes from after the apocalypse or the second coming, and you've got Zion and this other idea of a utopia where Hegel kind of has a similar idea, really. I mean, there's a utopia that he's looking for where we're throwing all of this off, but the arc of progression becomes an idea where you say, bringing up, are you on the right side of history? And I always think about this when people say that, because it's really more of an issue of are you going to be accepted to some degree?
That's right.
It's like, can I be on the side that everybody else is going to think I'm okay with? But if you go back and look at 1917, prior to October 1917 in Russia, and you were talking to someone and they're saying, they're pulling on heartstrings, the same thing, and empathy, and saying, do you believe in helping the poor? Right? Do you believe in helping the poor? Sure, I do. Okay, well, then you need to be a communist. You need to be part of the Communist Party and movement. It's like, well, I don't know if I like all this stuff. Well, then you must be a bad person.
Bread and land. That's right.
You must be a bad person if you don't have empathy for these people. And you better be on the right side of history. Do you want to be on the right side of history with this and what we're doing here? And I don't think people recognize that today.
Well, ultimately, there are all of the perversions of Christianity are easy to draw out because if we focus on Hegel was a crackpot Christian. Frankly, he was involved in a movement that was called the Swabian Pietist movement of Lutheranism in the Swabian region of southern Germany, which was filled with mysticism. It was kind of Christian mysticism, a la the late 1700s, 1790, thereabouts. And he was very deeply involved in this. A lot of the other big names of German idealist philosophy were also involved in this. Names like Schiller and Schelling and Goethe. These guys were actually Hegel's contemporaries. And so what Hegel was actually doing was taking these mystery religions or esoteric religions and hammering them into Lutheran Christianity. And so you end up with this kind of Trinity thing. He was actually a Neoplatonist. He believed that there's a perfect realm of ideas and that humans' jobs are to work out the ideas because we're the only creature in creation that can do it. And we're supposed to work out the ideas to remove the contradictions from the ideas, to remove the distinctions from ideas so that we see things that appear to be different to be parts of the same. And by doing so, that we would perfect the idea. And when we have a perfected idea, he said that the state is the divine idea as it exists on earth. So we would end up with a perfect state, which is almost like father, son. And then the state is going to produce a society which has a spirit, which he called a Geist. And there's your Holy Spirit, the spirit of society. But he said, until we get to this eschatological moment where the idea becomes perfected, so the state becomes perfected, so the society becomes perfected, and nothing else has to continue transforming. Before that, we have the best ideas that we have, and they give us the best state that we can implement, and that gives us a society that starts to discover the conflicts, that the imperfections in our idea, so that it can then have a revolution and have a more perfect idea in the next iteration. And so you get this idea that he was chasing after the ideal. Now we've got Rousseau preceding him and Marx following him. Marx actually was more focused on the material. He said all this ideal stuff is not where it's at. Hegel is wrong. He's not got it right. It is not about perfecting the idea. It's actually about perfecting the material conditions. So that's why we, the enlightened, who see the next bit through our Marxist theory, which he believed was the true science of reality, the true science of history. Hegel believed his philosophy was the true science of history also. In fact, he called Phenomenology of Spirit, is actually titled System of Science, Volume 1, The Phenomenology of Spirit. And so he really believed he was creating a science. Marx thought he was taking that science to where it needed to go, into the material realm. But you have the exact same model actually being derived. They both pulled it from Rousseau, but Rousseau was concerned about the social realm. So you have society, ideal, material, society, ideal, material, kind of operating in this sort of corkscrew through time. So Hegel wants to get the ideas correct, and we can start with Rousseau. Rousseau wants to get society perfected and through dialectical methods, and he can't. So then Hegel picks it up and says, no, it's in the ideas. Marx picks it up and says, no, it's in the material. That's not working. So where do they go? They go back into the societal, and you end up with a cultural Marxist theory. And as it starts to go into identity politics, is what is the ideal essence of each identity category? Where do they come from? How are they constructed? But this very idealist again. And so it's incorporated these other aspects, but now it's become very idealist once again, and that's woke. And then where are they turning next? Sustainability, that's material. And where are they turning after that? Global citizen and global consciousness. That's back to the societal ideal thing. And you can see that this wheel of transformation just switches. It's like people say it's like it's got many heads or many faces like a hydra. Well, it, in essence, has three, and you can really predict where they're going to go and how they're going to work. Once you understand that this is, they think, the true movement of history. And the point is to actually perfect history through perfecting man, whether it's through perfecting his conditions for Marx, perfecting the society around him for Rousseau, or perfecting the ideas for Hegel. It's all the same thing. They're just asking the question, what produces man? And sticking it in this transformational Gnostic cult, frankly. If it's economic conditions, then you get Marx. If it's ideas, then you get Hegel, philosophy. If it's society itself, you get Rousseau. If it's racial conditions, you get CRT. If it's sexual, who gets to be considered normal and an upstanding member of society, you get queer theory. And you can just watch all the pieces fall out. All you have to do is pick. Answer the question, well, what is it that really makes us who we are? Pick some answer. Say it causes a division between the haves and the have-nots, and you end up with a new Marxist theory just like that.
Yeah, that's, you have, going into today, you can see, as you're saying, where you want the new man and you're creating yourself, so to speak, with this new science. And it's kind of again, the opposite of what you might find in Christianity. But It's about becoming. And you can see how identity then would be a perfect answer and vehicle to move this cult forward, because that's what they've been doing the entire time. They're talking about becoming. They're talking about who, again, throwing off the shackles and becoming something else. So identity kind of fits perfectly into the entire movement.
Right. So we can talk about, for example, the kind of fairy godmother of queer theory is Judith Butler. Judith Butler is very famous for this concept called gender performativity. The summary of her views really is life is drag and drag is life. In other words, everybody's always doing drag. You're just picking the character.
I was just going over this in another episode with her. Yeah,
she's a piece of work. And so she got the idea of performativity from an earlier philosopher who most agree she misinterpreted, and that's J.L. Austin. And Austin was talking about, let's say that you are a judge, right? You actually are in a process, or I said football player earlier, you're always in a process of becoming the judge. In fact, if you're a judge, you're Greg today at home, Greg having dinner, Greg hanging out. But when you put the robe on and go sit at the bench, you speak a certain way, you sit a certain way, you talk a certain way. You have all these formal rules, part of which is purely symbolic to create the understanding to the people that you're dealing with of the importance of your office. And of course, this was a huge deal when Donald Trump was president. The big joke was today's the day he becomes presidential, because he never kind of went into the character of president that we are used to, this performed character that we identify with being presidential. So we have this idea of performativity of roles. You are, in a sense, performing presidentially when you're president and performing judicially when you're a judge. So this was J.L. Austin's idea, and it's an interesting enough idea, and we could go on to it with whatever. But what Judith Butler said is that actually that's true of your gender. You are not a man being a man. You are a man performing masculinity. You are not a woman being a woman. You're a woman performing femininity. But her thing was, whereas we might say, well, is it arbitrary how a judge acts? Is it arbitrary what qualifies as presidential? These kinds of things. Could it be different? Is it just a show? Is it fake? Can it be faked or whatever? What she's saying is, first of all, this thing is very intrinsic to who you are personally as your identity, not your job, but literally your biological essence as male or female is actually at the bottom being performed. But what she's saying is it's actually an not just arbitrary, but unjust power structure that forces you to behave that way, to perform that way. So society says, listen, Greg, you're a man, so you need to act like a man. And so by the time you're 7 years old, you've been flooded with messages about you need to be a boy, you need to grow up to be a man, masculinity, masculinity, masculinity. And you have been socialized into an identity that maybe was never what you wanted to be in the first place. So now you've been trapped in your own presentation of your body. You believe you have to perform your life the way that society told you to perform your life, and you're trapped in this. So the phrase for that from Michel Foucault, who Judith Butler quotes on this repeatedly, so it's important because she does it more than once in more than one of her major works, is the soul imprisons the body. And so the spirit of society tells you how you're going to have to be. You conform to that so you fit in. You get socialized or brainwashed into believing if you're a man, you have to act like a man. And if you're a woman, you have to act like a woman. And then you encode that into your very body, which then becomes a prison for you to live within. And what the goal of queer theory becomes is to throw that off, to liberate yourself from this alleged brainwashing. This is part of the reason why the queer theory cult goes after children so vigorously. The so-called noble savage who hasn't been socialized into the chains of society yet are children. They haven't been taught to be boys or girls yet if you get them early enough. And so they haven't been taught to grow up to be men and women according to these patriarchal constructs or whatever, society's constructs. And so you can actually liberate them from the path of believing that their performance is real, who they really are, by catching them early enough. So she perverts J.L. Austin. We said something about this continental philosophy. She was so desperate to be able to do this, she imported a huge amount of the French postmodern, that's Michel Foucault, for example, Jacques Derrida in particular, which she also just absolutely butchered and misinterpreted so that she could put it to her activist purposes. And this is really how in the sex gender sexuality realm, how everything kind of got screwed up as bad as it did. We could copy paste and do a similar discussion for CRT or the other dimensions of woke theory, but in the essence, that's what it is that there's this belief that society is imposing upon you conditions that socialize you into accepting your unjust conditions. But you can be awakened to know how unjust it is, and that you together as a class can then overthrow the people that are oppressing you. You don't have the power individually, but if you get together with a class consciousness, then you can overthrow the system. And that is what they have created and unleashed on society. I say they, but to be honest with you, it's we, because we didn't do our part to filter this stuff out. People who, I've dealt with this for a long time because I tried to expose academia. Nobody cared. And I was like, why does nobody care? And the most common responses I'd get when I would ask people, like, why is this not taking off? It was, nobody cares what happens in academia. Well, we spent 50 years not caring what happened in academia while it turned into cults. And now we send every one of our young people that we can to go get indoctrinated by a cult under the guise of being educated. Meanwhile, none of us even bother to look under the hood to see what's going on there. We just assumed everybody there was doing what they were supposed to. They weren't. So, I don't want to do some weird thing, but in a way we're complicit because we went to sleep. Which is
at the highest levels. Look at Harvard and what's happened there recently with Claudine Gay. And now recently we've got Sherry Ann Charleston, who's the chief diversity and inclusion officer, also going through plagiarism. I was just speaking with Carol Swain, and it's completely turned upside down. It's a meme. It's a parody of DEI that's happening at the highest levels of academia, where you have DEI becoming more important than actually putting someone who's qualified at the very highest levels of all of academia.
So I'll just loop that back to what we were just saying. What did Judith Butler say was the answer to the problem of entrenched power in society? She called it the politics of parody. In other words, you have people literally, all they're doing is performing president of Harvard. Claudine Gay was performing. She's an actor. This is why so many of the activists are theater kids. This is why we have politicians who are literally just actors, who are showing up and playing the role of a politician, but actually with their hands on the levers of power instead of, on a big screen in a movie.
They're posers.
They are. That's exactly right. But the entire philosophy is designed through doing that. The entire worldview, to the degree you accept it, believes that's all that's ever happening anyway. They literally believe that everything is constantly brainwashing through socialization. So they get to brainwash. Everything is just performance. So they can just go do, a highly scripted fake performance of the same thing. And so if AOC is acting, then she's doing a great performance. It's changing the world. And everything is always some fake pastiche, artificial thing. So they can step in and they have every right to come in and do some fake artificial pastiche thing, but with the values that they want to project into it, put at the center, which makes them intrinsically good. Nobody's doing anything of any value, by the way, in their worldview. Everybody's doing fake stuff. It's just whether or not you see the vision for the future or you don't, as to whether or not your fake stuff is good or bad. So somebody who's actually, out building a world, a business and making something happen in the world that's bringing, benefit to people's lives, they're just acting too. So if they get to the highest level of that corporation through whatever means and they just act and the company goes in the toilet, well, everybody was just acting. And it's just that obviously society wasn't ready to accept their more enlightened values, and that's why their company failed. And you can see how the externalization of blame is just completely natural to their entire worldview. It's so hard to get your head around the idea that your average functionary in this worldview believes everything is pretend, but they have better values than everybody else, so they get the right to pretend instead of anybody else.
So is this a part of an underlying, I don't know, I'd say belief, but understanding, an conscious understanding even of, hey, we're pulling away from reality. The movement actually does pull away from reality. Mm-hmm. And so if it's all performance, it's saying, well, the acting is more important than the actual reality of producing or what is actually happening. Is that right?
No, that's
a pull
exactly
away
right.
from reality?
No, that's exactly right. They actually think that at the very bottom, we were talking about Hegel with his book, Phenomenology of Spirit. Phenomenology as a kind of system of thought, there are a lot of things that go into it, and this is a severe oversimplification. But if you actually go look up, go to your search engine and type in define phenomenology, it will actually tell you that it is the belief that appearance makes reality. And so the appearance is really all, because it's what it's interested in is the study of the phenomenon, hence phenomenology. And the phenomenon is the appearance of the phenomenon as far as you can ascertain. So for them, appearance is reality. And so, yeah, that's exactly right. That's at the core of this view. So the world is actually, it goes back to the Gnosticism thing. This is a false world. The material conditions and constraints are not real. What's real is the spiritual world, which they've placed in sociology or society. That's what's real. That's who we really are. So it's a matter of getting right that way, not as a matter of paying attention to reality. So there's a lot of sayings to this. One is reality bats last. Another one is, which is a baseball metaphor for people not paying attention in the back. And another one is reality is the thing you run into when your beliefs are false, which is, I think, really poignant. I made that the theme or the thesis statement of one of my first major talks on this issue publicly many years ago. Reality is the thing you run into when your beliefs are false. And another way that I phrase this, though, is that the truth can't advocate for itself. It can only assert itself. And so when they pull away from reality, consequences come. What these theories work out to be is elaborate justifications for why somebody else is at fault, not the people that dropped the ball. I dropped the ball because you distracted me. I dropped the ball because something else happened. It wasn't my fault that I wasn't doing my job. Something else caused it to happen. And so these theories are elaborate, very elaborate systems of thought that justify that when you fail reality and it bites you, it was somebody else's fault. So therefore, you should maintain your position of power. If you're Claudine Gay, you should still be getting paid $900,000 a year while going on TV and talking about how people like you are so oppressed. And that's, I mean, at the end of the day, that's all this is it's an elaborate theoretical construct around the entitlement complex that is Gnostic cult belief.
It's interesting when you bring that up, because this has caused a watershed moment for demographics politically, because you have those, therefore, that will not fall into that idea, that have been on the left typically. So you've got classical liberals, people that are really, they hold the Enlightenment as an anchor, right? And science as an anchor. And so you've got a Jonathan Haidt and a Steven Pinker and others that even a Bill Maher, right? That are all of a sudden going, what in the world? This is not what I had signed up for. Yeah, I still hold on to these other truths, this science and what is produced from the Enlightenment. And so there's this shift, in a sense. Of course, Trump pushes that also the other way, but it's this shift in demographically where you have even someone like yourself. All of a sudden, I see you working with a number of evangelicals, and because you're on the same page with a number of these things, whereas before it would have been completely on the opposite side of the gulf.
Right. Yeah. So the dividing line, and I find myself saying this more and more often. I was actually I think I was in a public conversation with Charlie Kirk at one point, and he put me to the test and said, what's going on? And somehow I came out of my mouth that the dividing line, the real dividing line here, to put it theologically, and then I'll kind of put it in simpler terms afterwards, but to put it theologically, is the line is people who know that they're not God versus people who think that they might be. And what it actually boils down to on a more prosaic presentation is people who have the humility to realize that they're not the center of the universe versus people who feel entitled because they're somehow better than everybody else to have privileges in society.
Pride to some degree.
It is. I mean, it very much is it's the most fundamental biblical distinction of humility versus pride. The beginning of wisdom is the fear of God. Well, if you just to be secular for a minute, I know Christian people get upset about that, but take out the word God and put in truth. And I tell people all the time, the beginning of wisdom is the fear of the truth. You better be afraid of the truth, because it's going to hit you in the face if you're wrong. All these, my Instagram right now is filled with all these weird videos from China where they make these animations of, industrial accidents. So it says safety first at the end of every one of them, and it's these things where people are doing something on the job and they think that, they need to do, kick this thing out of the way to get the thing to move or whatever. And the thing falls on them and crushes them or whatever, because they weren't paying attention to how reality is actually going to work. If you aren't afraid of reality, and I don't mean living in fear all the time that something bad's going to happen, but if you don't have a healthy fear of reality or healthy fear of the truth or healthy fear of God, then you're not going to act in a wise way. And it's extremely important to therefore begin with humility. That this, whether you believe in God or not, most people probably watching this do, God or the world or reality, the truth is not only way bigger than you, but it doesn't answer to you. You can't change it, and you don't know most of it. There are the guy kicking the thing out of the way in the Chinese training video didn't think the thing was going to fall on him. There were things he didn't know about what would happen if he did that. And so his lack of knowledge is what actually led to him being in trouble. And so when you fall on the wrong side of that, pride goes before a fall. I mean, there's a billion sayings or even biblical verses about, if he's become wise in his own eyes, is a fool or whatever else. These things, this is, I think, the dividing line. So what you're seeing with these classical liberal types is that, yeah, maybe some of them are a little bit stuck up or a little bit arrogant or high on their own supply or whatever the phrase happens to be. The one I heard recently was huffing his own exhaust, which I kind of liked. Maybe they're a little bit of that, but at the end of the day, they still have that, they don't have that full-blown entitlement complex that like the world owes me because I'm special.
There's natural law and they still submit to it.
Well, yeah, and what I'm saying with this whole truth thing that I just did is if you don't, bad stuff will happen to you. Guaranteed. Bad stuff will happen if you don't submit to as it's phrased in the Declaration of Independence, the laws of nature and nature's God.
Yeah. Okay, so I want to move to how this acts, because this is this really does put out a carrot. This movement puts out a carrot of empathy and caring for others, and you'll be accepted, and all of these nice little things that say, hey, come on in, be part of us. And but if you read the actual works of those that have developed all this, I mean, one of them, for example, is Derrida, and you go and look at him at UCI at the end of his career, toward the end of his life, and he says, look, I've dedicated my whole life to making language a virus. And you had brought up, I listened to one of your broadcasts, maybe, it was a few years ago, and you brought up the paper that was written by the ASU professor. I think it was on queer theory. I can't remember, but I think it was queer theory in there.
Women's studies.
What was it?
It's women's studies.
Women's studies. Yeah. Okay. Women's studies. And how, I mean, she comes right out and says it, this is how we get this done. We are creating this as a virus. Can you address that as how a virus to me needs a healthy host?
Yeah, that's right.
It's got to have a healthy host. So the healthier it is, the longer it can last there, and the more damage that it can do.
Right. But I'll point out in that paper, which was titled Women's Studies as a Virus, in which she said the ideal metaphor for women's studies, and by extension, these other activist domains, is the virus as the model. She compares it favorably to HIV, Ebola, SARS, any virus that causes cancer, because cancer represents true transformational change. But later in the paper, and I say she, it was really they. There was a guy and a woman, Michael Karger and Brianne Foz were the authors. They actually have a discussion somewhere kind of near the middle, talking about conservatism acting like society's immune system, and that usually you need the immune system to fight off the virus. But in this case, you don't want that. You want the immune system suppressed so that there can be, they say, for whatever reason, it's the one virus that is good both for the host and for the virus, which I'm Absolutely. I stared at that in print and thought they couldn't have possibly thought this was right. But that is how it works. And since we all, the idea is that it is a virus. How do viruses work? Since we all just went through COVID, we all kind of know how viruses work now. Right. So viruses come in and they contain nuclear material, RNA or DNA, and they attach to healthy cells at things that are called receptor sites. The famous one with COVID-19 was the ACE2 receptor. I don't know what that is, but apparently it was important. And so the virus has some kind of a set of proteins on its external surface that attach to a receptor site. The cells have receptor sites that allow things to be able to pass into the cell because it needs nutrients, or to pass out of the cell because it has to get rid of waste. So these viruses exploit that by having the same chemical protein signature. They latch on, and when they latch on, instead of delivering something good, they inject their nuclear material, their DNA or RNA into the cell, and then that hijacks the cell's reproductive process and in protein synthesis process, and it starts running through that aspect of nuclear code, and what comes out is lots more virus parts that are semi-assembled. Eventually the cell gets filled with these things. It can't do its own job, and it dies and ruptures, and those virus parts self-assemble and then go and attach to others. So you keep bringing up kindness and empathy. Those are the receptor sites that Marxism uses. It injects this collectivist Gnostic framework, this very, intrinsically, it's called conflict theory. The idea that class struggle across some line of division or stratification in society is the essence of how society works. It injects that into the body politic through the cells of society, are people. So it moves them through their empathy. That's the primary receptor. And what I was saying earlier then is that it turns out that this virus got unleashed, and in peasant societies, economic conditions are a very sensitive spot. So there's a good receptor site, and classical Marxism injects. But in the West, we don't have that receptor. Western civilization developed differently. We don't have that receptor site, so the virus couldn't get in. So it mutated, and it went after things like racial justice, and we're soft to that. And so the viral DNA can get in, and you start having institutions and individuals start to reproduce the viral DNA, which is ideas. In this case, it's philosophical worldview. It's commitment to a set of beliefs or interpretations of how the world works. In fact, it's a phenomenology, and it injects that into its host, and basically it runs everything down, just like every other virus. When you get sick, the virus doesn't turn you into Spider-Man. You feel awful. What happens is actually that it attaches to the host and injects itself and starts using the cell's energy or the institution's energy to reproduce more virus, which eventually runs it out. And if it ruptures or dies or collapses, fine, it did. But the idea is that it put out way more viruses in the meantime. And in more practical terms, whether that's in terms of physical capital or in terms of goodwill, which we could call social and cultural capital, what it does is it latches onto places that have lots of those and spends it down to produce more Marxism until it collapses. So it latches onto a corporation like Disney, pushes, whatever inclusion or queer theory or whatever, it's pushing all these different things as hard as it can. Disney's down $50 billion in value, by the way. So it's spending down all of Disney's capital, and eventually Disney will die. But in the meantime, it produced a billion more little viruses that have watched Disney shows and got kind of pulled in by them. If it attaches to Harvard, the goodwill toward Harvard just dries up. And in fact, so does capital. But now it used to be that the Harvard brand meant something. The Harvard brand means something completely different just 1 year later. Even though Harvard's been at this for, most of a century in some degree, it finally came to a head, and we realized, and so the goodwill people, and it's even more abstract without an institution involved. Look at Pride 2022 versus Pride 2023 and how well it was received. Pride 2022 was out of control, everywhere, in your face, hugest thing ever. 2023, people were like, I'm over it. They lost the goodwill of the people. There isn't even an institution involved. People are like, I'm done with this. Black Lives Matter burned through it with racial justice in 8 months. So it attaches to different aspects of society and burns through its stored up capital until that thing collapses. And that's why one of the reasons that Marxism destroys everything it touches isn't just because it's organized around destroying everything it touches, which is true, but also because I heard it this way the other day. Marxism is excellent at conquest and terrible at management. So it comes in and it takes over and it mismanages everything until it dies. And the reason it's terrible at management is the only thing that it's good at doing is making more Marxists. The only thing that it thinks is important to do is make more Marxists. Because for them, as a Gnostic religion, it's about consciousness. The people that have the consciousness, the new man, is going to remake society. So we just have to make as many new men as possible. Their belief system, if you want to be as charitable to it as possible, is we will have the utopia when everybody who's still alive believes in it with all their heart.
Yeah, and then but of course, then there's nothing left. But yes, now I want to take that and apply it over to Christianity and look at the virus and look at Christianity. I've got friends at the SBC. I've got friends in the Church of England. You had, what was it, 2019 in solution I call it potion number 9. Love potion number 9, but number 9, where they added critical race theory as a way to look
SBC
at
Resolution
Scripture.
9.
They pulled it back a couple of years later, but these things, Church of England, they've got affiliates now that have left because of the threat there at the Church of England, where they're looking at LGBTQ issues, they're looking at women in the priesthood. A lot of these different things are happening. You've got the split of the Methodist Church again, and all of this is, as I look at it, is the same thing as this virus is coming in. But the difference on this is when it seems to me that what has to be done to make the change is that you have to soften things up. There has to be, say, a receptor, as you're saying. There's got to be a good receptor in place. And so you see something like God being changed into this teddy bear as much as possible, and soft, where there's no judgment, there's no consequences, right? It's just acceptance and tolerance and love and kumbaya everywhere. And then once it's soft, it's malleable.
That's right.
And then we can move it over into where I could see it heading with a number of different denominations, into a political revolutionary, right? That is the head of we're fighting against the oppressors. And again, instead of looking at where most of Christianity is going to be focused on that individual, as you talked about, it now can say, no, you don't need to worry about that. We can take the Ibram Kendi approach and say that salvation theology is wrong. Yet what we really need to look at is a revolutionary theology that is against the oppressors.
Right, exactly. A theology of the oppressed, or a social theology. And I say this a lot to kind of characterize that. I say this to a lot of Christian audiences, which is, Jesus instructs to be as wise as serpent and gentle as doves. And what they do is they put all the focus on the gentle as doves part. And they're like, oh, you don't want to be like snakes. You want to be gentle, 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 gentle. They appeal to niceness. They appeal to the greatest virtues, charity, neighborly love, brotherly love, or whatever, through Christianity. I see this. Christianity is turning out to be, I was a little bit taken by surprise by this. It turns out to have been I've been predicting that critical immigration theory is going to come in and succeed critical race theory, and the queer theory is the primary mass line coming in the, next period of time. I don't know exactly when, but it's kind of gotten off the ground, and it was actually targeted at major Christians first. There was, the people on the other side of the razor wire are your neighbor. You're commanded to love thy neighbor. And you can see that it's just taking a Christian teaching and twisting people on their own values. That's so communist to do that. But it's not really a surprise that you have this, focus on the nice, focus on these charity, kindness, welcoming, forgiveness. Oh, I messed up. Forgive me, kind of attitude, give them another chance. It's like, these guys are literally subverting, maybe it's your church, maybe it's your country. Do not give traitors another chance. Because you're not being wise as serpents here. They get that part out of the picture. But it's not a surprise, because like I said earlier, Hegel was hammering all of this stuff into a Christian framework. He created a Christian heresy that people just haven't, or Neoplatonist Christian heresy that people haven't recognized. He very much was obsessed with the concept of the Trinity, but it's not God that is, it's God that becomes now. And the human activity that work out the contradictions allows God to realize who he is and awakens. Hegel was straight up a crackpot Christian heretical cultist. And then Marx wanted to take exactly those virtues. A lot of people forget that Marx grew up Lutheran, and in his teenage years, he wrote a lot of kind of very pro-Christian theology, and I mean, it's amateur because he's a kid. But then at 19, he switched and became an atheist, so to speak, and decided to throw it down. But what Marx largely created, all those motifs were there, plus he's picking them up from Hegel. He created an inversion of Christianity. It is specifically tailored to take advantage of Christian values, which is why it was so readily accepted by the Russian Orthodox Church when the Bolsheviks ran through Russia, because it's exploiting those values. So you heard it with COVID, especially the whole love thy neighbor. That was exploited massively. Now we see it with this border thing that's massively being exploited to take in the poor and the widows and everything else. That's being exploited with this crisis that they call a migrant crisis, but it's criminal aliens coming across in huge numbers. They want there to be this very diffuse lack of discernment. And I think that that's the general thrust, is that they want there to be a lack of discernment. This thing and that thing are basically the same thing, even though they're not. So what's another good example of that? I'm trying to think of one. They always talk about all the deaths caused by capitalism or whatever. It's like deaths that were caused by a tyrant forcing an ideology on somebody, as happened in communism to the tune of hundreds of millions. That's one thing. Those are still deaths. Meanwhile, people, dying in the factory floor through the dangerous conditions of trying to build things that's capitalism killing people too, and it's still deaths. That's not the best example. I see these things 5 times a day, and I see so many, I can't pull out the one that's a good example anymore. But you'll see it everywhere. Is what they're trying to do, that they always do, is that 2 different things are the same thing in some way that's totally bogus. And that is what they do to Christians in particular.
Tolerance, everybody knows that. Tolerance. What is tolerance really
right,
mean?
yeah.
Is it okay, I can love someone else, I can accept someone else, or does it mean advocacy?
That's right.
Yeah.
So they do this all the time, and they are particularly good, and have been historically particularly good at doing it through twisting Christian values. So you end up with these, liberation theology was a twisting of Catholic values. That was a deliberate KGB infiltration into the Catholic Church that produced it. On the other hand, you have the social gospel that arose in the early 1900s, like 1905, thereabouts, from Walter Rauschenbusch, who had gone off in the years previous and studied with the Fabian socialists. And he came back and he said that the real point of the gospel is social justice. And actually, the reason Jesus died wasn't for our sins. It was specifically for our sins of social injustice or oppression. And he created this kind of twisted gospel. And Marxists are just really good at this. I think it's because their underlying architecture is Christian, and then they flipped it over and turned it evil. But the love thy neighbor thing has just been, a workhorse for them in the last, several iterations of this, COVID, the border crisis in particular, to try to manipulate Christians into living up to an incorrect interpretation of their own values. But it's always with the nice. There is no, if you get led into temptation, that's bad. There is no Sodom and Gomorrah fell into degeneracy, so God hit it with a comet. There's that part. There's no wandering in the wilderness and complaining in the Book of Numbers. So God's like, I'm not letting him into the land of Canaan. Done. I gave him 10 miracles, which is probably even a symbolic number, not a literal number, which meant lots and lots of miracles. They still don't trust me. No, I'm done with them. And Moses begs, and God's like, yeah, okay, I'll be nicer to them, but they're still not going in. So there's still this hard line. Like, if you're not willing to get along with the program, there's this other side of God or of reality where if you're not wise as serpents in addition to being gentle. But those receptors are particularly lit up, so to speak, on Christians, and they are particularly manipulated, therefore, by the the wolves in sheep's clothing of Marxists.
Yeah, it seems also that women are even more susceptible to this because they kind of have that empathy naturally, right, which they have to have for their children and their babies, et cetera. But that it really hits them, and then they are the social bond, right? And it's so you've got this receptor more with women that will accept this a little bit more easily, but then it can spread out easier because women really are the social bond out there.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, there's a ton of reasons why it attaches like that. Now, I actually think if we were going to play this kind of more complicated game, I would say that what you saw in the Soviet Union, Bolshevik, was a very masculine, in a sense, communism. And what you see in woke is a very feminine approach. And this is why it's harder for us to figure out what to do. You know what to do with the masculine type. You go to war with it. You just go beat them up. You can't do that with woke. And I mean, like, even like taking a hard stand, raising your voice, posturing, the whole thing, because now you look like a dude going after a woman. And it just comes off bad in the watching public that isn't fully aware of why you're doing what you're doing and what's happening. Just gets the perception that you're this, big burly guy pushing a woman around. Woke is coded very feminine. It pulls very hard on these empathy, heartstring kind of things, social fabric, the way that people, whether or not people are going to be left out, whether there's enough for everybody. These kinds of modes are extremely present. It's also just so much more passive aggressive, whereas the Bolsheviks they did a lot of passive aggression and a lot of nasty tricks like that, but it's hard to accuse them of being merely passive aggressive.
That's so what now. So this virus has entered in, you had Gramsci, what it was his pillars. You had family, law, media, education, and religion. I think those are the five.
Those are the five.
He didn't think of. He probably could have never dreamed that this would be one of them. Is business, the actual heartbeat of capitalism. But now that's taken also with DEI. So you look at. You had, what was it? Wall Street, Occupy Wall Street. Where has the protest been since then? Right,
yeah,
they haven't existed. Crushed. Why? Because the whole institution changed. Right. And you had the infiltration of the DEI office. And so now you can add that as a sixth pillar that is all of a sudden fallen. But
seventh, actually, because Stalin recognized that medicine was and the Soviets were vicious. Also the Chinese Mao was vicious with the application of medicine. They had one of Mao's rivals, political rivals, so another CCP guy, was known to have had diabetes. And so Mao said that medicine must serve the people, or in other words, must serve socialism, the ideology. And so in that belief, his political rival had diabetes, and what he was being given by his nurses when he got put in the hospital for, whatever, probably just made up reasons, or he got beat up and got put in the hospital, he was given direct injections of sugar. And of course he died because medicine was meant to serve the revolution in socialism. And so medicine became a sixth pillar that Gramsci hadn't really envisioned. And then you're correct. The big change since roughly 1978 or so, plus or minus, a decade, was the infiltration into business, the development of what we should call corporate Marxism, which is why people can't see that it's Marxist, because it's largely coming from the so-called bourgeois elements of society.
Yeah, that's fascinating. But these institutions now are taken, and I'm not a doomsdayer. I'm a pretty optimistic guy, but I look at this and I think, how does any of this turn around? I mean, when you've got all these institutions, and to me, I think it's the tip of the iceberg so far. This stuff, as it gets mainstreamed in our culture and into each of these, you wake up and you listen to the media and you get fed there. You go to work, you get fed there. You come home and everybody else has been fed all day with this stuff and indoctrinated, and you talk about it and you foment this in your home. Are we at a point where we can turn on this, an axial moment, or are we just at that tip of the iceberg with what's happening in the institutions?
No, I think we're very close to the axial moment if we haven't already passed it. I'm actually extremely optimistic at this point. It's different in different domains, though. Like education at all levels is going to be very difficult to recover. And I think that the strategy there will have to be massive divestment of the existing institution so that it starts to hit rock bottom. What that means is pulling our kids out of K through 12 education programs that have any of this in it, whether public or private. Public is completely infested. What that means is starting as hiring managers in corporations that have the power to do so, to pull back from being as eager or willing to hire graduates from especially the Ivies, but going down through college students, rather than that putting you to the front of the line that either leaves you somewhere in the middle or maybe puts you behind the go-getters who had the sense not to go to an indoctrination center for 4 to 10 years. That's one domain. What about with the public itself? What happened within the Soviet Union that led to its eventual collapse was that the general person started to first understand and then be able to whisper, then be able to say that the things that they were being told were lies. So you're getting fed by CNN and you're getting fed by your corporate, environment or whatever, your DEI requirements for HR. And when lots of people start to believe that's a lie, that's a thing that tips very slowly, then all at once. It actually is a thing that hits critical mass, and then people realize everybody's talking about it, and then everybody's talking about it. And all of a sudden the whole sham is seen through. And I think we're actually pretty far, we're not all the way down that road. I talk to some Democrat people sometimes and it's like, really? You're still at like the church of CNN? But for the most part, the awakening has been overwhelming. And I think we're very rapidly approaching that tipping point. Think of the things that you feel utterly comfortable saying out loud now that you did not feel comfortable saying 2-3 years ago. We're making a lot of progress in that domain. Business is different. Here's what I think. I think that there are kind of 3 levels of people operating within businesses. And there are the ringleaders, and then there are the striver class underneath that wants to climb the ladder at any cost. They're not particularly moral people necessarily. And then underneath there, you have the functionaries who are doing all the stuff. Well, the ringleaders are the ones causing everybody to have to play along with this. The functionaries are the ones getting fed this that have to go along. The strivers are the ones who are actually doing it. And the thing with strivers is they're not particularly ideologically committed and they're not particularly moral. They're particularly in it for themselves. So if this is how organized crime gets taken down. And what's happening in our business environment is in fact cartel behavior. We have these huge financial institutions that have instituted a global corporate cartel. All it takes is enough to come up to where these things start ending up in hearings and so on. And some people start to go to jail, where what's going to happen is that people in that striver class that are actually the people implementing this stuff, the pushers, are going to start to think, maybe this isn't a good deal for me. We don't think nearly enough about how weaponized the craven class. All they have to do is start to believe that the current program could turn to a bad deal somewhere soon down the road, and there's a better deal somewhere else, and they will start to jump ship. The rats will jump ship. We see the rats starting to jump ship, but just barely. So as ESG and DEI and these things continue to fall into disrepute, if there are incentive structures available for people to want to jump ship and to become, whistleblowers or whatever else, then you're going to start to see the whole cartel structure get uncovered. And then depending on where the locus of political will and power lies, you can start to see tools being used to dismantle this. We're doing that largely at the state level in certain states. Missouri stands out right now, but Texas, Florida, several of these other so-called red states, Oklahoma has put some steps forward. Obviously, Marlo out there in Utah Marlo Oaks has done some really good stuff. He's probably the person most individually responsible for stopping the NAC program that was being proposed by the New York Stock Exchange.
That did not pass.
That did not come to pass. They'll have their revenge, but this is what I'm talking about with the people. We all know that. We just say it. Oh, they're going to change the name. Like, you're not going to fool us. It used to be, oh, they're going to change the name and just do it. Now people say they're going to change the name and make me mad. Like, the attitude is different. And so we're starting to reach those late Soviet conditions, but they never actually got full power over us. In the population, we have the opportunity to shake up the business. I think at every day we're one whistleblower in the right place at the right industry away from lots of rats jumping ship and all of a sudden wanting to get out before somebody goes to jail. Because some of the things that they're implementing are super illegal. So somebody's going to this is all going to land hard on people's heads unless it all gets pulled off. They crossed the Rubicon at least when they unleashed COVID, but probably before that when they started going heavy into ESG investing in the mid 2010s. They don't have a way back. And that's why I think you saw so many CEOs and other executives from corporations all resign in 2018 and 19. Go look it up. It's the most that have ever done in one time period ever. Wonder why? Well, that means they knew what was coming or had some hint about what was coming, which means some of this was orchestrated, which means some people are on the hook for an awful lot of fraud. Imagine that you're an investment banker and you were giving somebody a 30-year mortgage knowing that this was all the whole transformation's coming in the next 10 years. How can you possibly give a good faith 30-year mortgage when you know it's all going to break in 10? So that's fraud. And these people are massively exposed. We just haven't got to the point where that exposure is actionable yet.
Yeah, or putting your retirement income into something that's going to be regulated under ESG guidelines. And it's like, okay, well, maybe this wasn't the best idea, but you really help the environment out. And so anyway, yeah, you're right. I don't know if I share all of your optimism. I want to get there. I really do. But this has been awesome. This is fabulous. Thank you so much for coming on the program, sharing the information that you have. You're told, hey, if you want to really be successful at something, focus in on one thing and be the best at it. And I think that you're that person in this area. So really appreciate you coming on and sharing all this information with us. And hopefully one day we'll get you back. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, well, I'd be happy to. So thank you.